All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. You ready to do it?
Ready.
All right, here we go. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Guy McPherson here, and very excited to have as my guest today, Shannon Moroney. Shannon, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are welcome. Shannon is the author of 2 best-selling memoirs, Through the Glass and Out of the Shadows. She's an internationally recognized advocate of restorative justice and travels extensively to lead transformative forgiveness workshops and retreats for people in communities overcoming trauma, and to keynote justice and mental health conferences. She's a registered social worker and trauma therapist specializing in treating survivors of sexual assault and trafficking and the family members of people who offend. All right, Shannon, just a little bit about you. But before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Sure. I was born in a city just west of Toronto called Mississauga. It's a suburb, and I am now broadcasting to you from Treaty 13 territory, the traditional land of the Haudenosaunee,
Oh, wow.
and many other First Nation groups, also known as Toronto. Awesome. And in our time of truth and reconciliation, we are learning to properly address the land on which we are uninvited guests. So that's where I'm broadcasting from, and very, very specifically my garage. Which is the most beautiful garage in this city, which I'm super grateful to have as a writing studio and as a place to see my clients. Although, of course, during the pandemic, I see most everybody on Zoom, which is because we can reach clients.
Awesome. I appreciate you sharing that. All right, so let's dive in here. You, first of all, again, thank you for coming on here. What you're doing is incredible. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, it's super inspiring. How did you get into this field?
So I came into this field really through my first work as a high school guidance counselor, actually, and before that, a teacher. So in Canada, you have to be a teacher first before you can become a guidance counselor. But I think I just really realized early on in my teaching career that my best work was listening to kids tell me some things that they might be ashamed about, or things that they were working through in their lives. So I then quickly moved to gain a specialist in certification in counseling. And then it was while I was a guidance counselor, high school guidance counselor, that trauma came into my own life. I had been recently married to someone I would describe as my soulmate, my very best friend, someone who had overcome a lot in his life. We'd lived really happily together for a couple of years, and just a couple of weeks after I turned 30, we got married on Thanksgiving weekend of 2005. And a month after that, I was away at a counseling conference in Toronto. We lived a couple of hours north of Toronto, and a police officer came to the door of my hotel room to tell me that my husband had sexually assaulted and kidnapped 2 women at his workplace the afternoon before at a health food store, and brought them to our home. And then he had, after they very bravely tried to talk with him and tried to rehumanize him in the basement of our home after being brutally assaulted and injured, I called him, as I usually did when I was away, had a very light chat. I had no idea that 2 women were suffering and fearing for their lives in my own home. I told Jason that I was proud of him. I told him I thought I might be pregnant. And he said, "That's great. We'll take a test when you get home tomorrow." But after our phone call, he left our home and he went down the hill. We lived on top of a hill, to a payphone, and he called 911. and he asked for help, and he told the police what he had done. And so that, in fact, that experience is really the entry point to my work to help others overcome and shape trauma in their lives and achieve post-traumatic growth after having to learn all about that myself and all about stigmatized loss and terrible, terrible things like guilt by association. And I actually ended up going back to school during that time. My small community became actually a very unsafe place for me to live. When my job was taken away from me as a high school guidance counselor, I was just simply told that, how could I be a good counselor when I was married to this monster? People said I represented something terrible. And I was told that I would take an unpaid medical leave until my doctor said I was ready to come back to work. And at that point, very early on after his original arrest, I was diagnosed with this, like having experienced a secondary trauma, or the second trauma really is a better way to put it, like the aftershock of a giant earthquake, which can cause just as much damage. I was diagnosed with PTSD and really became unable to work. Somehow I was able to fill out an application for a master's in social work and then win a scholarship to study trauma and restorative justice in that master's of social work in England. And so that's how things began to take shape for me. And then I ended up writing my story into a memoir called Through the Glass, which led to speaking and work, led to the writing of someone else's memoir of her trauma and post-traumatic growth through trafficking, and then led for me to sort of come back full circle to my very first love, which was counseling, which was helping other people through their trauma. And right now I have a very, very busy full-time practice as a trauma therapist in Toronto. I'm a registered social worker, and I do expert witness work as well. And right now, I'm actually, I'm sure many of your listeners will be following the Peter Nygard investigation. Peter Nygard is now a disgraced fashion mogul, accused of he has 9 counts, federal counts of sex trafficking, sexual assault, and more in the United States. He's here in Canada waiting extradition, and he's also facing trial here in Toronto for multiple counts of sexual assault and forcible confinement here.
Let me
I
just,
know work with, sorry, I'm going on and on.
Pause here for a second.
That's my resume.
Yeah. First off, Shannon, thank you for sharing that story. I mean, there are no words for that. I mean, it's crazy and harrowing. How long had you been married to him before this started?
Well, we lived together for about 2.5 years, okay. and a loving and wonderful relationship. But we were actually married for exactly 1 month.
Okay, but you've been together for 2.5 years.
Well, we've been together for a long time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before we go on, there's something you said earlier on that I want to go back to. You said earlier, your best work was listening to kids. Talk more about that. What was that like for you? How did you realize that?
Gosh, I think it just felt so natural. I think a lot of times our careers choose us. We don't really choose them. And I certainly, no one chooses membership to the trauma club. But once we're on the inside of it, you actually see, gosh, there's really a whole lot of wonderful people in here. And there's a great gift in stewarding trauma for others. And so even before I'd really experienced any, like the big T trauma in my life, certainly had other challenges and so on. And I just always found it to be a gift to listen and support kids. And they would just naturally tell me things. I think it's just my whole life, even I remember when I was just maybe 17, and that would have been in the early 90s. And I had a colleague that I worked with disclosed to me as the first person in her life that she was lesbian, and then asked me to go to a lesbian bar with her because she didn't want to go alone. And I said, of course I will. Of course I will. Let's leave out the part where we were underage. Let's say we were 19. Maybe we were. That's the age that we can go to parks in Canada. But I just think I've always been that person. I'm really non-judgmental. I really care about the human story. And I just find it a privilege when people can trust me and confide in me. So I think it just started from a very natural place.
So when this happened with your husband, you were a clinician at that time?
Yeah, I was a school counselor.
You've been a school counselor. Okay. How do you deal with it? How did you deal with that? How did you process that?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I actually remember a very distinct moment, maybe just a couple of weeks into the trauma journey, a couple of weeks after my husband was arrested, and realizing as people in my life were kind of falling away. I received some hate mail. I received blame. I received beautiful things like a tiny lasagna on my front door from a neighbor saying, "Hey, we're here for you. We don't judge you." But, watching your world, you're so powerless in those moments, watching your world reshape itself and fall away and crack and shatter. It is so terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. And I remember thinking, it's a really good thing that all this time I've been telling kids to be your own best friend, because that is who I have to be for myself right now. I'm going to be the only person that I can 100% rely on here. And it was like, putting my arms around myself and going, okay, we're going to get through this. I don't know how. And I want to express my gratitude to my ever-loving parents and family members and people that did support me. And I made this commitment, and it might sound so silly, but I think you'll really understand. I think your listeners will really understand. I'm an earrings person, actually, as you can see today. And I remember standing in front of my dresser and being sort of barely able to get dressed, being terrified. I'd already lost so much weight, and putting on my earrings and telling myself, this is what we're going to do every single day. Every day you are going to get out of bed and get dressed and put your earrings on. And that's where we're going to start. And in all of it, in what ended up being, if you can imagine, after a full confession and a statement that matched the victims and wanting to share a guilty plea, it took 2.5 years for my husband's criminal trial to resolve, and for him to actually become the first person in Canada to accept our highest penalty here, which is called the dangerous offender designation, and essentially means a natural life sentence. We don't have the death penalty. And I supported him in doing that. I supported his accountability. And there was only one day in all of that I didn't get out of bed. And that was the day that my job was taken away from me. And other than that, I put those earrings on every single day. And I, of course, relied on all the factors that uphold resilience. I'm resourceful. Fortunately, my skills as a counselor, and as even my very first degree was in international development and community development. And that's all about building resources and asking for help. And that was something I was able to do. And I was turned away at many, 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 many doors. At that time, there's certainly no organization for the family members of sex offenders. I felt like the only one. I couldn't find a book about it, which is why I ended up writing the book that I most needed to read. I was a very lonely journey at times, and really the only place I was fully welcomed was a restorative justice organization. But being resourceful, having that resolve and commitment to myself, these are what I call the R's of resilience, relationships that uphold and sustain you.
Did you seek out therapy for help?
I sure did. Yeah, I absolutely did. It was really challenging. I had this colossal story that was also very much in the media. And I say this even to my own clients when they're calling to see if I'm a good fit for them, and we talk about how I work and what they're looking for. And I always say, I advise you to talk to a few different people, or if they're coming to me to say, look, I already tried 3 therapists, and I say, we all have to kiss a few frogs before we find the therapist we're looking for. And I sure did. And what I found to be so difficult was that I would go to someone, I would share my story, and then they would look traumatized. The therapist would look traumatized and look like they needed help. And then I'm going, yeah, I don't think you're going to be able to help me. Because it is an extremely special gift, I think, to be able to, and then there are so many wonderful trauma therapists. And I did find somebody who is, was absolutely wonderful. And my family doctor actually helped me more than anyone in the beginning. Was my family doctor, and all through it, and even till today I call her my guru. But to really be able to handle someone else's story for them and not respond to it personally, at least to them. We've got to all have that. And when I work with families of traumatized people, I always say, we've got the person in the center, the people in the center who are most acutely and directly affected, and they need to be able to lean out on all the layers of the circle. So the next ring around them might be their close family and friends who may also be affected. So those people actually then have to lean out on the next circle around, which might be professionals. And if everyone leans out a bit, then you can almost picture that, whole school of people on a field. No one ever has to fall completely over. We're creating that insulation. It's very hard for people in trauma, and I experience this when the people directly around you are affected and they lean in on you. And that happened to me a lot. Shannon, well, how could this happen? What did you do? And well, how are you processing this? Or why? I love this one. Where is your anger? This is so demanded of me in the early days of trauma. And all I could say was like, I'm sorry to disappoint you. My heart is way too broken to hold anger. Anger came later, for sure. And it was terrifying. But, being leaned on to explain things or support others was absolutely suffocating. And I came to a place where I just actually had to say to people, like, I need you to get your own therapist or have other people talk to you. You can't talk to me about it. I'm drowning here. A lot of different ways of coping.
Yeah. You talked about the getting to a point where you wanted to or needed to write the book that you needed to read. Talk a little bit about how you got to that point.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people said to me, you need to write about this, which is funny to me because I wasn't a writer, or I always say that, but then I realized I had probably written 500 letters to people. I'm way older than I look, but I was just a wholehearted letter writer in my life. And I'd lived overseas in a couple of places, Indonesia and Ecuador, and even way up in northern BC. And I just love to write and describe things and bring people into a place that they were probably never going to go. And so maybe that's what people saw in my ability to write about it. But also, Jason's criminal case was, quite remarkable, most remarkable, in fact, by his accountability. But my experience of it, just what I was going through, and I would write these sort of updates every once in a while to people in my life and what was happening. And in the end, my book really it's a book of 2 journeys. One is my personal journey of heartbreak and all the cover images of broken glass. And that's what it really meant. And the title, Through the Glass, refers to, really trying to walk through on that broken landscape of sharp glass, as well as conversations that I had through the glass of a prison wall, of a prison visiting room with my ex-husband, Jason. But the other part of the journey is as a witness on the justice system, and just sometimes just not believing what I was seeing happen in front of me. I just never had that close vantage point to the justice system and how it actually can be so traumatizing and re-victimizing to people. So it was really just came to me by suggestion, but for the first while, I mean, I just thought, thank you for that suggestion that I write a book. That sounds completely awful. Why would I ever want to do that? I have to relive everything. And it's such a terrible story and there's no ending and there's no happy ending. So I just couldn't do that. But, there did come a time, it was actually after the very first time I was asked to speak about my experience at a conference, a restorative justice conference in Mexico. And having that experience of just sharing in a 45-minute talk, I was able to just really touch on the major themes. But it was essentially a retelling of my victim impact statement that I had the opportunity to give in court at the end of a 2.5-year trial on Jason's sentencing day. I was able to give this victim impact statement. But when you give it in court, it's just like, it's so empty. There were some people, like the court, I remember one of the court clerks or guards was crying. But all that happened, for the assault victims, first and foremost, but for me as a collateral victim and as well as a victim of some crimes of voyeurism, for my mom, who was a victim of voyeurism that my husband had committed, it was so empty. There's no response. It's just like the gavel came down and my statement was entered as Exhibit 13 and a piece of art, which is kind of cool that was brought forward into evidence as Exhibit 13B. And that was it. And so when I had the chance for the very first time to give a very similar, statement or speech or talk to an audience that could respond, an audience filled with lawyers and ex-cons and victims and victim advocates and judges, and they actually responded by getting on their feet and giving me a standing ovation. And I couldn't believe it. I had felt like a nobody. I was terrified to get up there. I was so terrified of more rejection, more stigma. But they turned it all around. They turned it all around by listening. They turned it all around by saying, let's work on these issues that you've raised. And so I think that was the day. It was actually I will never forget. It was the day after my 32nd birthday, I think, 33rd birthday. Actually, I guess I can forget. I remember the day after my birthday. And then I came home from Mexico, and that's when I started to write. I absolutely knew that I needed to write, because even in just a 45-minute talk, I could only touch on the basics. And what I really wanted to get into was all the nuance and all the detail. And I knew that if I could reach this one room of 75 people, then I could reach so many more people.
The nuance and detail
really
of what specifically?
Of my own journey through this, from the moment that the police officer came to my door until, essentially the book ends with what began a new chapter for me, from, actually achieving the ability to trust again, the ability to love, to remarrying and becoming a mom of twins.
Let me just reintroduce you. I'm speaking with Shannon Moroney. Her website is shannonmoroney.com. We'll have that linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Shannon, at what point obviously you've written books, you have a message. What is that you want to get out there?
Oh, many different things. Thank you for asking. I want people who have endured trauma, whether it's little t trauma, the persistent woodpecker, things like abuse and putting down an oppression, to big T trauma, like I experienced, a massive event that takes the reins of your life. I want people to know that there is such a thing called post-traumatic growth. And that while we don't have a choice of what others do or say or how they might harm us, we do have a choice about how we're going to respond, and that we need support to make those choices. And I think that's probably the most essential part of my work, the work that I do every day with individuals in my practice, to the work I do as a speaker and educator. And also, what I'm really focusing on now as well, at the 10-year anniversary of my first book coming out, of my memoir coming out, is forgiveness as the new F word. So my brand new book that's just coming out is called Heal for Real, a guided journal to forgiving others and yourself. I know that we are on video as well, so there might be somebody, people out there having like, oh, here's her big sister. This is the big sister through the glass, and little sister just coming out. Heal for Real, a guided journal to forgiving others and yourself. Forgiveness was a really, really big part of my journey, not ever forgiving what Jason did, but forgiving the human being that I knew and loved that was behind that horror. And then also finding forgiveness for what happened in the ripple effect of trauma, for my school board that took my job away, that I never came into dialogue with. In Jason, I was so fortunate I had an accountable, remorseful offender who could apologize to me and who could listen to all the impact of his actions to me and to our community and to his victims. But we don't always get that. Right. Most of my survivors I'm working with now, they've never had that from Peter Nygaard, the people in other cases, and offenders in their own families don't get that. I didn't have that with my school board. I had to develop what I call abstract forgiveness, where we don't actually need the other person or the other party to be in active engagement with us to be able to find or develop our own definition of forgiveness, of what it means and what it doesn't mean to us, and then actually put it into action in our lives. And that's what Heal for Real really does. Is the first, I can just sort of show you and your readers that there's some stories and guidance. There's places to write little bits. There's it's all about exploring forgiveness. Sometimes it's just circle a word. Sometimes it's draw something small. Look, sometimes there's just a blank page, because sometimes we just need to sit and think about it. But the very I call forgiveness the new F word, because I think we've been telling everybody and ourselves to F off for a long time. In a bury it, I don't care, I'm stronger than steel, this isn't going to affect me way. And as a therapist and as a trauma survivor and thriver myself, I know that there's so much strength to be found in compassion, in accountability, in this thing called forgiveness that means so many different things.
How did you
never ever means condoning a harmful act.
When did you get to the point where you were able to forgive? I mean, that's for a lot of us, and especially within this context, people might say, oh my God, how the hell do you forgive? But what was your story? How did you get to that point where you were able to do that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It's really interesting. I think I actually, looking back, I realized that I forgave Jason the instant that I saw him through the prison glass, crying, remorseful, broken, the monster that was in the newspaper headline.
What does it mean to forgive? What is that? What does that mean?
So for me, what I saw in that moment, I had this complete unbidden thought that came into my mind that was, it could be me. It could be me on the other side. And I don't know. I just think that I wouldn't have used the word forgiveness at the time. I didn't use it for a long time, but I think that was my opening moment to going, that is a human being that has just acted utterly inhumanely. And I'm a human being. So what's the difference in our lives or life circumstances or our chemical makeup or anything like that that puts him on that side of the glass and me on this side? And so was the beginning of it. And then but I want to say, and I want to tell your listeners, I've had forgiveness relapses. It's a hard thing. I mean, I think it's just not something that you offer once. I mean, sometimes in smaller things you offer once and you're like really truly done. And sometimes it is really forgive and forget. Most of the time it's forgive and remember with reverence. But for me, I will say that forgiveness, I mean, sometimes people say, forgiveness lets somebody off the hook. And we think that that's the offender. We think that we're letting them off easy, or they're not going to be punished, or they're just going to go ahead and do it again. But I always say, yes, actually, forgiveness does let somebody off the hook. It's the person who offers it. And for me, whenever I have relapsed in my forgiveness and bitten the hook of anger and resentment and rage, I am the one who pays. I'm the one who gets punished by it. It is no fun to live in anger and resentment. And this really happened, when my baby twins were born. It was so difficult. I would say I've had two traumas in my life. One was horrible and one was beautiful. And the beautiful one was having I found babies, and like at the same day that my first book came out, I found I was expecting them. And then it was a very traumatic birth. It was all a mess. It was a complete disaster, incredibly cute. And I just did not feel equipped. I didn't have enough milk. I didn't have enough rest. And I blamed Jason. After 5 years of forgiving him, I turned it all around in my forgiveness relapse, and I blamed him. I wrote him a horrible letter and sent it to his prison. And I was like, I forgave you too soon. I am a mess. I don't get to enjoy being a mother because it took everything I had to get through what you did. And now I'm depleted. I have no reserves, and it's your fault. Mm-hmm. So not only did I do that, and I recount this story in Heal for Real, not only did I write the letter, I sent it. Like, cringe, just major cringe. And but it didn't do me any good. I was just wrapped up in this resentment, and it was robbing me. It was robbing me of my ability to love and enjoy whatever minutes in the day I could my two little beautiful baby girls. And so choosing forgiveness, recommitting to it, is the only thing that could release me from that and free up my energy to have any kind of enjoyment in my life. And again, fortunately for me, Jason got that letter. He called me several days later. It had arrived when they were on a lockdown, so he got to sit in his cell with it for about 5 days. And sometimes we have fantasized the lusty thoughts of punishment for our offenders, but the reality is, if we're not violent people, it doesn't actually make us feel that much better. Maybe just for 5 minutes, it makes us feel better to feel them being punished. But what could he say on the phone? All he could say again was, "I'm so sorry. I'm so, so sorry. What can I do?" And what can he do from prison? I mean, all that happens in prison is you just serve time. Justice doesn't get served. Only sentences get served. So it was up to me. And that's where the empowerment of forgiveness is. That's where the choice lies. I could choose in that moment to remember that he's a human being, to accept his apology, to release myself, to let myself off the hook of this anger and bitterness and resentment, and even forgive myself for some of the ways that I acted in the worst parts of my trauma, and say, it's okay, you're doing your best. And that's been the process.
As we kind of wind down here, I want to let everyone know that we'll have these books linked up at the show notes page, traumatherapistpodcast.com, Through the Glass and Out of the Shadows, and then Heal for Real. When is Heal for Real going to be published?
Heal for Real is ready to be shipped January 4th. So It's really, really soon. Yeah. Okay. If folks are listening now, they'll get it right away. Yeah. And I'm really proud of it. It's really a hands-on, step-by-step guide and whatever you're trying to forgive, whatever, even if you think it's small, but it's on your mind all the time, or it's a long ago hurt, or it's in the present time, this book is for you, and I guide you and hold your hand through it. And then I have an online community as well at healforreal.org.
Awesome. Shannon, I want to thank you so much for not only coming on here, but just sharing your story and doing it openly and vulnerably. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, this is not easy for anyone at any stage. And I think really appreciate you coming on here and doing that.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I sure appreciate it.
You're welcome. All right. Take care.
Okay. Love to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.